I accidentally created a family with my neighbor, and now they expect me to take responsibility. I'm being called a deadbeat dad and I don't even have a kid, and that's the part that makes this whole thing feel unreal. Like I've been dropped into someone else's life without signing anything. It all started when I moved into this small duplex just trying to get some independence, nothing fancy, just cheap rent and quiet neighbors. And next door was Kayla, who seemed normal at first. A little too friendly maybe, but nothing I couldn't ignore. She brought over cookies the first day. Said something like, "You seem like a good, stable person. I needed someone like that next door." And I remember thinking that was just typical neighbor small talk. But looking back now, it feels like the first piece of something I didn't understand yet. At first it really was normal. She'd ask for small favors, I'd help carry groceries, sign for packages, basic stuff. But then she started slipping in weird comments like, "You'd be a good dad," or "If I had a kid, I'd want them to be like you." And I'd laugh it off because what else are you supposed to do with that, right? But then, things escalated in a way I can't even explain properly without sounding insane. One day I come home and there's a little kid sitting on my porch, just chilling like he belongs there, playing with a toy car, and before I can even process it, he looks up and says, "I live here," like I'm supposed to understand that. And then Kayla just casually tells me that's Mason, and she had to run upstairs for a minute so I could just watch him, like it was the most normal thing in the world to drop a child on someone's porch without asking. I confronted her immediately, and she just shrugged like it was nothing, like, "You were coming home anyway." And that line stuck with me because it made it sound like she planned it that way. After that, it didn't stop. It became this pattern where she'd ask me to watch him for 5 minutes that turned into hours, and sometimes she wouldn't even ask. She'd just leave him there like I was already part of whatever arrangement she had in her head. And the kid started getting comfortable with me too, calling me funny, hanging around like I was part of his routine, which would have been fine if it wasn't slowly building into something heavier. Then came the part where people outside started treating it like a fact, like I was this involved father figure, and I remember an older lady from the neighborhood casually asking how my son was doing, like she was catching up on something obvious. And when I told her that's not my kid, she gave me that look like I was lying, like I was just another guy avoiding responsibility, and that's when I started realizing Kayla wasn't correcting anyone. She was letting it happen, maybe even feeding it. I tried to set boundaries after that. Told her straight up I can't keep doing this. I'm not responsible for this kid. And she looked at me like I was being selfish, saying things like, "He needs stability," and "You're good for him." Like that somehow overrides the fact that I never agreed to any of this. And I should have cut it off right there, but I didn't fully understand how deep it was already going. The kid started calling me dad one day out of nowhere and I froze. Because Kayla was right there and she didn't correct him. She just watched like it made sense. And when I asked her about it, she said, "He likes you." Like that explained everything. And when I pushed harder, she just said I was already acting like it anyway. Like I had somehow stepped into a role I never accepted. That's when people in my life started turning on me too. Friends saying things like, "Just step up," or "It's not about you anymore." Like I was supposed to just accept responsibility for something I didn't create. And even my mom got involved saying things like, "I can't run from responsibility." And I remember just sitting there thinking, how is everyone agreeing on something that isn't true? Then one day I got sent a picture from Kayla, no explanation. Just a drawing the kid made of a stick family labeled "my family," and one of the figures looked like me. And she said, "That's what he sees." Like that settled it. Like perception replaces reality. And that's when I started realizing this wasn't accidental anymore. I went over there to confront her properly, and for the first time she hesitated when I asked about the real father, saying it was complicated, avoiding the question. And I realized she had been carefully avoiding ever giving a real answer this whole time, like there was something she didn't want me to fully connect, and that's when I realized in her mind it didn't matter if it was true or not. It only mattered what she needed me to be in the situation she was building around me. And just when I thought it couldn't get more twisted, there was a knock on my door late at night. And when I opened it, there was a man standing there looking dead serious. And the first thing he said was, "You've been spending a lot of time with my son." And in that moment, everything I thought I understood about the situation. And when I opened the door fully and saw that man standing there, everything in me just went cold because he wasn't confused or asking questions like, I expected he looked like he already knew me, like he had been watching this situation unfold from a distance, and finally decided to step in. And he just repeated slower this time, "You've been spending a lot of time with my son." And I immediately said, "Your son?" Because at that point, my brain was refusing to accept anything else. And he nodded like it was obvious. Like I was the only person missing the memo. And that's when Kayla appeared behind him in the hallway. Like she had been waiting for this exact moment. Not surprised at all, just calm. And I remember turning to her like, "What is going on?" And she didn't answer me right away. She just looked between both of us like she was measuring reactions. And the man finally said his name. Said he had been out of state for work and only recently found out his ex-Kayla had been letting people believe different things about custody and involvement. And I swear my stomach dropped because the way he said it made it sound like I wasn't the only one being fed a version of reality. Like there was a whole mess of assumptions and silence that had been building before I ever even moved in. And I immediately turned back to Kayla like, "So you just let people think I'm the father?" And she finally spoke, but it wasn't a denial. It was more like it was easier. And that one line just set something off in me because easier for who? Not me, definitely not me. And the man looked at her too, like he was hearing that for the first time. Like he didn't even realize the extent of it. And then things started spilling out in pieces, how he had been inconsistent, how she had been struggling, how Mason had been asking questions about who was around. And somehow in that chaos, my presence got folded into something I never agreed to. Like I was a placeholder that just happened to be there at the wrong time. And I remember backing up into my own doorway, just trying to process it, because on one hand it sounded like a broken situation between adults I was accidentally dragged into, but on the other hand it still didn't explain why I was being publicly labeled, why people in the neighborhood were repeating it like fact, why my friends were pressuring me like I signed paperwork I never saw. And that's when the man suddenly turned to me and said something like, "Look, I'm not here to blame you. I just want my son to stop calling a stranger his dad." And that hit me harder than anything else because it confirmed I was exactly that in his eyes, just a stranger who got trapped in proximity. And I finally snapped and said, I never told him to call me anything. I never agreed to any of this. And Kayla interrupted for the first time, saying he feels safe with you. Like that somehow justified the entire situation. And the man looked at her like he was realizing this wasn't just misunderstanding. This was actively being maintained. And for a second, nobody spoke. It was just this heavy silence where I could hear the kid inside the apartment laughing at something on TV like none of this existed. And I remember feeling this weird mix of anger and disbelief because I wasn't just being misunderstood anymore. I was being positioned, like my name, my face. My presence had been inserted into someone else's story without consent. And then the man finally said he wanted clarity, real clarity, and that we all needed to stop letting assumptions run everything. But before anything could get resolved, Kayla's phone buzzed loudly from inside the apartment, and she looked at it and went completely still. Like whatever she saw changed the air in the room. And she didn't show it to either of us. She just said quietly, he knows. And I asked, he who? But she didn't answer. And instead she walked back inside like the conversation was over, leaving me and this man standing there in the hallway, staring at each other like we had both just been introduced to a situation that was way bigger than either of us understood. And that's when the man finally said, almost under his breath, there's something she hasn't told either of us. And right as he said that from inside the apartment, I heard Mason call out again clear as day, Dad? And this time he wasn't talking to Kayla. And when I heard Mason say Dad, again from inside the apartment, it felt like the entire hallway just froze, like even the air got heavier. And the man beside me actually turned his head, slightly like he was trying to confirm he heard the same thing. And I just stood there thinking, how did I end up in a situation where a kid is calling two different men Dad, in the same breath of reality? And I walked inside first because I needed to see it for myself. And Kayla was standing in the living room now, holding her phone tight like she was bracing for something. And Mason was on the couch looking back and forth between me and the man at the door like this was some normal family tension he was used to. And I remember asking him gently, who are you talking to? And he pointed at me first, then at the man and said, both. Like it was the simplest answer in the world. And that's when the man stepped in and said, nobody, I'm your dad. And I saw Kayla flinch slightly like she didn't expect him to say it that directly. And I immediately turned to her like, this is insane. You need to explain what is actually going on. And for the first time, she looked genuinely overwhelmed instead of calm, like her control over the situation was slipping. And she started saying things like, it's not like that, and he doesn't understand everything. But nothing she said actually clarified anything. It just made it messier. And the man started asking her about paperwork, custody, timelines, things I didn't even know existed in this conversation. And I just stood there realizing I was the only person in the room who had never been part of any of this history. I was like an extra they forgot to brief. And then the man suddenly turned to me and said, I'm sorry you got pulled into this, but I need you to understand you can't be in the middle of it anymore. And that should have been the moment I finally walked out clean. But then Kayla said something under her breath like, he already is. And I asked her what that meant, and she didn't answer directly. She just looked at Mason and then back at me. And that silence was worse than anything she could have said, because it made it feel like there was a version of events I still hadn't been told. And I started pushing harder, saying, why does everyone in this neighborhood think I'm his father? Why are people treating me like I signed up for something I never agreed to? And that's when she finally admitted, not fully but enough to shift everything, that she never corrected assumptions. Early on because it made things easier with neighbors, easier at school conversations, easier when people asked questions she didn't want to answer. And I just stared at her because what she was basically saying was, she let a lie spread because it was convenient. And now I was standing in the center of it getting hit with the consequences. And the man looked furious but also tired, like he had heard versions of this before. And he said we needed to figure out a stable arrangement immediately so Mason wouldn't keep getting confused. And I cut him off and said, I'm not part of any arrangement. And that's when Mason suddenly got quiet and said something that completely shifted the room. He just asked, so you're leaving too? And it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, it was just confused. Like he had already experienced people disappearing in and out of his life and was bracing for another one. And I looked at him and for the first time I didn't feel anger. I just felt stuck because no matter how wrong everything was, this kid was now emotionally tied into it. And that's when Kayla quietly said, this is why I didn't correct it sooner. And the man immediately responded, you don't get to use him as a reason for this. And suddenly they were arguing again, not even about me anymore, but about history, responsibility, truth. And I just backed toward the door realizing I was standing inside a conflict that existed long before I ever moved in. And right as I reached the doorway to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. And I looked down expecting something irrelevant. But it was a message from an unknown number that simply said, you should ask her about what happened before you moved in. And I looked up at Kayla and she saw my expression immediately, like she knew exactly what I had just read. And in that moment, she said my name softly like she was trying to stop me from asking. But it was already too late because the man noticed the shift too and asked, what happened before you moved in? And Kayla didn't answer right away. She just looked at the floor. And that's when I realized whatever story I thought I was in was only the middle of something way bigger. And then she finally said, it's not something we need to go into right now. But the way she said it told me it was exactly what everything depended on. And the man stepped closer like he wasn't going to let it go this time. And Mason sat there looking between all of us, like he could feel the tension but didn't understand it. And I stood there realizing I was about to hear something that would either clear my name completely or drag me deeper than I ever wanted to be. And just as Kayla opened her mouth to finally explain, there was a sharp knock at the door again. Slower this time, more deliberate. And all three of us turned toward it at once. And I swear in that second, I already knew whoever was on the other side wasn't gonna make any of this simpler. And when that knock came again, slower and heavier, like whoever was on the other side already knew they had everyone's attention. The entire room just went still mid-chaos. Kayla stopped talking, the man didn't move. Mason even went quiet, like instinctively picking up that this wasn't normal anymore. And I remember walking toward the door first because at that point, I was already too deep to just stand there and wait. And when I opened it, there was an older woman standing there holding a folder. Not smiling, not confused, just locked in like she had been preparing for this exact moment. And she looked at all of us behind me before saying my name like she already knew it. And then she said, "We need to clarify something before this gets worse." And my stomach dropped because I immediately knew this wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't random. This was connected. And she stepped inside without waiting for permission. Like she had authority in the situation. And Kayla's entire expression changed the second she saw her. Like whatever control she had left just got pulled out from under her. And the man asked straight up who she was. And she said she was involved in past documentation and mediation regarding Mason's custody situation, which immediately made the room feel even tighter. Because now this wasn't just emotional confusion. It was official history being dragged into my living room. And she opened the folder and said something that made my head spin, that there had been misunderstandings and how information about guardianship and caregiving roles had been communicated in the building. And I cut her off immediately like, "No, stop, I was never a guardian. I was never anything, I just live next door." And she looked at me like she expected that response, like she had heard it before. And then she said something that made everything worse instead of better. She said that informal caregiving arrangements sometimes get perceived differently by communities when repeated. Exposure creates assumptions. And I just laughed because it sounded insane, like I was being legally analyzed for being too helpful. And the man stepped forward and said, "Are you saying he's been presented as the father?" And she didn't answer directly, which was somehow the loudest answer possible. And Kayla finally snapped and said, "This wasn't supposed to become this big." And the older woman turned to her and said, "It became big when you stopped correcting it." And that hit so hard the room actually went quiet again. And Mason, still sitting on the couch, just asked, "Why is everyone arguing about me?" And nobody had a good answer for that. And I felt this pressure building in my chest because I realized every adult in the room was talking around him, around me, around truth. And then the older woman said something worse. She said there had been prior confusion in community, records and informal statements that led to inconsistent assumptions about paternal involvement. And I stopped her again like, "What records? What statements? I never signed anything." And she finally looked directly at me and said, "Not from you." And that's when it clicked in the worst way possible. Because this wasn't about what I did or didn't do. This was about what other people had been saying. I was without my knowledge. And the man immediately turned to Kayla like, "What did you say?" And she hesitated too long. And that hesitation told me everything. Because silence in that moment wasn't neutral. It was confirmation that my name had been placed into a story I never agreed to. And she finally admitted that in conversations with neighbors, school forms, and casual explanations when she didn't want to go into detail, she had allowed people to assume I was involved because correcting it meant explaining more than she wanted to. And I just stood there feeling like the floor, dropped out because it wasn't a single lie. It was layers of avoidance stacked on top of each other until I got buried under them. And the man looked like he was trying to stay calm but failing, saying, "You can't just assign someone a role like that." And Kayla responded, "It wasn't supposed to be permanent." Like that made it better. And I snapped and said, "You don't get to use me as a temporary explanation for your life." And that's when Mason suddenly stood up and asked loudly, "So who is my dad then?" And nobody answered right away, because that was the real question underneath all of it. And the older woman closed the folder, slowly, like she knew this was the moment. Everything shifted. And she said there were still unresolved gaps in official acknowledgement. And the man immediately said, "I'm right here." And Kayla said, "You were gone." And I just stepped back, realizing I was watching a history I wasn't even part of, but somehow got dragged into the emotional consequences of. And then the older woman said something that froze everything again. She said there had been repeated inconsistencies and how Mason's caregiving environment had been described over time. And before anyone could react further, Mason walked over and grabbed my sleeve lightly and said, "Are you leaving now?" And I looked down at him and couldn't answer fast enough. Because every adult in the room had turned this into something complicated and legal and emotional and messy, but for him it was still just people coming and going. And I felt Kayla watching me like she already knew what I was going to do. And I looked at the man, then the folder, then the door, and I realized no matter what explanation existed, I was standing in a situation that was already in motion long before I ever arrived. And right as I finally said, "I need to go," the older woman quietly added, almost like a warning, "You should understand, there's still one more conversation that hasn't happened yet." And I asked what she meant. And she just looked at Kayla instead of answering me, and Kayla's face went pale in a way I had never seen before. And in that exact second, my phone buzzed again in my pocket, and I pulled it out without thinking. And there was a new message that said, "Don't leave yet, you still don't know what she told them about you." Because it made it feel like there was a version of events I still hadn't been told. And I started pushing harder, saying, "Why does everyone in this neighborhood think I'm his father? Why are people treating me like I signed up for something I never agreed to?" And that's when she finally admitted, not fully but enough to shift everything, that she never corrected assumptions. Early on because it made things easier with neighbors, easier at school conversations, easier when people asked questions she didn't want to answer. And I just stared at her because what she was basically saying was, she let a lie spread because it was convenient. And now I was standing in the center of it getting hit with the consequences. And the man looked furious but also tired, like he had heard versions of this before. And he said we needed to figure out a stable arrangement immediately so Mason wouldn't keep getting confused. And I cut him off and said, "I'm not part of any arrangement." And that's when Mason suddenly got quiet and said something that completely shifted the room. He just asked, "So you're leaving too?" And it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was just confused. Like he had already experienced people disappearing in and out of his life and was bracing for another one. And I looked at him and for the first time I didn't feel anger. I just felt stuck because no matter how wrong everything was, this kid was now emotionally tied into it. And that's when Kayla quietly said, "This is why I didn't correct it sooner." And the man immediately responded, "You don't get to use him as a reason for this." And suddenly they were arguing again, not even about me anymore, but about history, responsibility, truth. And I just backed toward the door realizing I was standing inside a conflict that existed long before I ever moved in. And right as I reached the doorway to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. And I looked down expecting something irrelevant. But it was a message from an unknown number that simply said, "You should ask her about what happened before you moved in." And I looked up at Kayla and she saw my expression immediately, like she knew exactly what I had just read. And in that moment, she said my name softly like she was trying to stop me from asking. But it was already too late because the man noticed the shift too and asked, "What happened before you moved in?" And Kayla didn't answer right away. She just looked at the floor. And that's when I realized whatever story I thought I was in was only the middle of something way bigger. And then she finally said, "It's not something we need to go into right now." But the way she said it told me it was exactly what everything depended on. And the man stepped closer like he wasn't going to let it go this time. And Mason sat there looking between all of us, like he could feel the tension but didn't understand it. And I stood there realizing I was about to hear something that would either clear my name completely or drag me deeper than I ever wanted to be. And just as Kayla opened her mouth to finally explain, there was a sharp knock at the door again. Slower this time, more deliberate. And all three of us turned toward it at once. And I swear in that second, I already knew whoever was on the other side wasn't gonna make any of this simpler. And when that knock came again, slower and heavier, like whoever was on the other side already knew they had everyone's attention. The entire room just went still mid-chaos. Kayla stopped talking, the man didn't move. Mason even went quiet, like instinctively picking up that this wasn't normal anymore. And I remember walking toward the door first because at that point, I was already too deep to just stand there and wait. And when I opened it, there was an older woman standing there holding a folder. Not smiling, not confused, just locked in like she had been preparing for this exact moment. And she looked at all of us behind me before saying my name like she already knew it. And then she said, "We need to clarify something before this gets worse." And my stomach dropped because I immediately knew this wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't random. This was connected. And she stepped inside without waiting for permission. Like she had authority in the situation, and Kayla's entire expression changed the second she saw her. Like whatever control she had left just got pulled out from under her. And the man asked straight up who she was, and she said she was involved in past documentation and mediation regarding Mason's custody situation, which immediately made the room feel even tighter. Because now this wasn't just emotional confusion, it was official history being dragged into my living room. And she opened the folder and said something that made my head spin, that there had been misunderstandings and how information about guardianship and caregiving roles had been communicated in the building. And I cut her off immediately like, "No, stop, I was never a guardian. I was never anything, I just live next door." And she looked at me like she expected that response, like she had heard it before. And then she said something that made everything worse instead of better. She said that informal caregiving arrangements sometimes get perceived differently by communities when repeated. Exposure creates assumptions. And I just laughed because it sounded insane, like I was being legally analyzed for being too helpful. And the man stepped forward and said, "Are you saying he's been presented as the father?" And she didn't answer directly, which was somehow the loudest answer possible. And Kayla finally snapped and said, "This wasn't supposed to become this big." And the older woman turned to her and said, "It became big when you stopped correcting it." And that hit so hard the room actually went quiet again. And Mason, still sitting on the couch, just asked, "Why is everyone arguing about me?" And nobody had a good answer for that. And I felt this pressure building in my chest because I realized every adult in the room was talking around him, around me, around truth. And then the older woman said something worse. She said there had been prior confusion in community, records and informal statements that led to inconsistent assumptions about paternal involvement. And I stopped her again like, "What records? What statements? I never signed anything." And she finally looked directly at me and said, "Not from you." And that's when it clicked in the worst way possible. Because this wasn't about what I did or didn't do. This was about what other people had been saying. I was without my knowledge. And the man immediately turned to Kayla like, "What did you say?" And she hesitated too long, and that hesitation told me everything. Because silence in that moment wasn't neutral. It was confirmation that my name had been placed into a story I never agreed to. And she finally admitted that in conversations with neighbors, school forms, and casual explanations when she didn't want to go into detail, she had allowed people to assume I was involved because correcting it meant explaining more than she wanted to. And I just stood there feeling like the floor dropped out because it wasn't a single lie. It was layers of avoidance stacked on top of each other until I got buried under them. And the man looked like he was trying to stay calm but failing, saying, "You can't just assign someone a role like that." And Kayla responded, "It wasn't supposed to be permanent." Like that made it better. And I snapped and said, "You don't get to use me as a temporary explanation for your life." And that's when Mason suddenly stood up and asked loudly, "So who is my dad then?" And nobody answered right away, because that was the real question underneath all of it. And the older woman closed the folder, slowly, like she knew this was the moment. Everything shifted. And she said there were still unresolved gaps in official acknowledgement. And the man immediately said, "I'm right here." And Kayla said, "You were gone." And I just stepped back realizing I was watching a history I wasn't even part of, but somehow got dragged into the emotional consequences of. And then the older woman said something that froze everything again. She said there had been repeated inconsistencies and how Mason's caregiving environment had been described over time. And before anyone could react further, Mason walked over and grabbed my sleeve lightly and said, "Are you leaving now?" And I looked down at him and couldn't answer fast enough. Because every adult in the room had turned this into something complicated and legal and emotional and messy, but for him it was still just people coming and going. And I felt Kayla watching me like she already knew what I was going to do. And I looked at the man, then the folder, then the door, and I realized no matter what explanation existed, I was standing in a situation that was already in motion long before I ever arrived. And right as I finally said, "I need to go," the older woman quietly added, almost like a warning, "You should understand, there's still one more conversation that hasn't happened yet." And I asked what she meant. And she just looked at Kayla instead of answering me, and Kayla's face went pale in a way I had never seen before. And in that exact second, my phone buzzed again in my pocket, and I pulled it out without thinking. And there was a new message that said, "Don't leave yet, you still don't know what she told them about you." And when I read that message, "Don't leave yet, you still don't know what she told them about you," it felt like my stomach just dropped through the floor because it wasn't vague anymore. It wasn't misunderstandings or assumptions or neighborhood gossip. It was specific, like someone on the outside knew. There was a version of me being circulated that I hadn't even seen yet. And I looked up immediately and Kayla saw my face change again. and I could tell she knew I had seen something, because her entire posture shifted, and the older woman noticed too, watching both of us like she was connecting pieces faster than I was, and the man asked what it was, and I almost didn't say anything. But I did. I read it out loud, and the room just went silent in this different way, like the air got sharper, and Kayla finally said, "You're being dramatic," but her voice didn't match her words. And I just turned to her and said, "What did you tell people about me?" And she shook her head like she was trying to avoid it again, saying things like it wasn't like that and people misunderstood, but I was done with vague answers at that point. And the older woman suddenly said, "There are written accounts," and that made my head snap toward her because that was the first time she made it sound concrete, and she hesitated for the first time too, like she was debating how far to go. And then she added that in several informal reports and community notes tied to the building, my name had been referenced as a consistent male guardian presence. Meme, and I literally laughed out loud because I thought it had to be a joke. Like there's no way, I've been here barely long enough to know my neighbors. And I said, that doesn't even make sense. And the man nodded immediately like he agreed with me. Like he was also realizing how far the narrative had drifted from reality. But Kayla suddenly interrupted and said, "I didn't say it like that." And that was the moment everything narrowed down to her. Because it wasn't about neighbors guessing anymore, it was about what she directly communicated. When she thought, I wasn't paying attention. And I pushed harder, asking her exactly what she said when people asked about Mason. And she finally admitted, not fully but enough, that when people questioned why a young child sometimes spent time with me, she had said I was helping out regularly, and that I was around a lot. And she said it like those words weren't loaded, but in a small community that apparently turned into something else entirely. And I just stood there thinking about how something casual to her had become a full identity assigned to me, without my consent. And the man shook his head like he couldn't believe it, saying, "You can't just casually describe someone into being a parent." And Kayla snapped back, "I was overwhelmed." And that's when the older woman cut in again and said something worse. She said this wasn't the first time confusion had been corrected late, and that patterns like this tend to escalate when no one explicitly clarifies roles early. And I interrupted her and said I was never in any role. And she nodded like she wasn't disagreeing, which somehow made it even more frustrating because it meant I was being affected by something I didn't participate in at all. And Mason, still standing there quietly, finally said, "I thought you were my dad because everyone said you were." And that sentence hit harder than anything else in the room because it showed exactly where all of this landed, not in adult confusion, not in paperwork or community assumptions, but in a kid-building understanding out of whatever scraps were left around him. And I looked at Kayla waiting for her to correct it, to finally draw a line, but she didn't, not immediately. And that pause told me more than anything she said, and the man stepped forward again saying, "This has to stop right now." And the older woman agreed but added that stopping it now doesn't undo what's already been internalized. And I just rubbed my face realizing I was somehow in the middle of damage control for a story I didn't write. And I said out loud, mostly to myself, "I didn't sign up for any of this." And Kayla quietly replied, "Neither did I." And the man looked at her like that wasn't good enough anymore, like intent didn't erase consequence. And then my phone buzzed again, and I didn't even want to look at it, but I did anyway. And this time it was a second message from the same unknown number that just said, "Ask her what happened before you moved in, before you were even part of this." And when I read it, the older woman actually looked at me and said, "You should ask that," like she already knew what it was referring to. And I turned to Kayla and said, "What happened before I moved in?" And she immediately went quiet. Completely different silence this time. Not defensive, not annoyed, just shut down. And that's when the man looked between both of us and said, "There's more." And Mason sat back down slowly like he could feel the shift in energy without understanding it. And Kayla finally whispered, "It's not something you need to know." And I said, "It clearly is if it's affecting me like this." And she looked like she wanted to stop the conversation entirely. But the older woman added softly, "It already reached other people." And that's when I realized whatever had been said about me wasn't just casual misunderstanding anymore. It had a source, a beginning, something that started before I ever got here. And Kayla looked at the floor and finally said, "When you moved in, people were already asking questions about stability and support." And I said, "That doesn't answer anything." And she nodded slowly and said, "Because the truth isn't simple." And the man immediately said, "Then start from the beginning." And the room just stayed frozen as she took a breath, like she was about to finally explain something she had been avoiding since the day I met her. And right as she opened her mouth again, the lights in the hallway outside flickered once, and there was another knock, this time not at my door, not hers, but from downstairs in the building entrance. Louder, more forceful, like whoever was coming wasn't asking anymore. And all of us went quiet at the exact same time, because whatever was about to walk in next wasn't part of what we had already been dealing with. And I had this sinking feeling that the answer I was about to hear wasn't going to fix anything, it was going to expand it. And when the knock came from the building entrance downstairs, louder this time, like whoever it was didn't care who heard, everything in the room just locked up again. And I could feel that same sinking pressure from earlier, but worse because now it wasn't just our little circle of confusion. It felt like something external was about to enter and confirm or destroy everything. And Kayla didn't even finish her sentence before she went completely quiet. The man stepped closer to the door, like instinctively preparing for confrontation, and Mason just sat there watching all of us, like he had learned that adults only get louder when something important is about to happen. And I finally said I was going to check it, because at this point, I was done being blindsided in my own hallway. So I went downstairs, and when I opened the building door, there were two people standing there. One was a guy I didn't recognize immediately, but something about his expression felt familiar in the worst way. And the other was a woman holding what looked like more papers. And the guy looked at me and said my name, like we had already met in a conversation. I never had. And then he said, "We need to talk about what's being reported about you." And I immediately said I had no idea what he was talking about. And the woman flipped through her papers and said my name had come up in multiple informal community statements tied to childcare, involvement at Kayla's unit. And I actually laughed because at this point it sounded insane hearing it repeated like it was official. And I said, "I literally just live here. I don't have a kid, I'm not involved in anything." And the guy nodded like he believed me, but also like that didn't change what had already been written down elsewhere. And then he said something that made my stomach twist again. That when repeated descriptions align over time in a community environment, perception starts to replace clarification unless someone explicitly corrects it early. And I said, so you're telling me I'm being labeled as a parent because people kept guessing and no one stopped them. And the woman paused before saying, essentially, and I just stood there in disbelief because that meant my entire situation upstairs wasn't even about truth anymore. It was about momentum, and I asked them directly who started it, who first said my name in that context, and they both hesitated and then said, Kayla had been the one to describe me as consistently present support. And I felt my chest tighten because that was exactly what she admitted earlier, except now it was on record in other people's interpretations. And I went back upstairs immediately because I needed answers from her directly. And when I walked back in the apartment, the tension was completely different. Like everyone already knew something had expanded beyond the room. And Kayla saw my face and immediately said, you talked to them. I not a question, and I said, what did you say about me? And she tried again to step around it, saying things like, it wasn't meant like that, and you were around. You helped sometimes. And I cut her off and said, stop describing me. Tell me what you told people. And that's when she finally admitted it more clearly, that when neighbors, school forums, or casual conversations came up and she didn't want to explain the full situation of her, and Mason's father being inconsistent, she used me as a simple explanation. Not intentionally malicious, just convenient. Saying things like I was a regular presence and helping out. And I remember just standing there thinking how something she said casually had turned into something I was now being questioned and documented over. And the man immediately said, you used him as a placeholder explanation. And she snapped back that it wasn't like that. That she was just trying to keep things simple. And the older woman from earlier stepped in again and said quietly that simplicity doesn't matter when it changes how a child or community perceives identity. And Mason suddenly spoke up from the couch asking, what does placeholder mean? And nobody answered him right away. And that silence hit harder than anything because it showed how far removed he was from the adult. Arguments happening around him. And I finally turned to Kayla and said, do you understand what this has turned into for me? And she looked like she did, but also didn't want to fully accept it. And then I said, you didn't just avoid correcting people. You replaced me in a story I never agreed to. And the man nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. And Kayla finally said softly that she didn't expect it to spread like this, that she thought it would stay local, stay informal, stay contained. And I said, that's not how reality works. And then everything paused again when Mason quietly asked me, are you still my dad? And I looked at him and didn't answer immediately because I realized every answer I gave in that moment would shape something I didn't control. And I finally said, I'm not your dad, gently but clearly. And his face changed in a way that made my stomach drop because it wasn't anger. It was confusion mixed with disappointment, like something he had been holding onto just got pulled away. And Kayla immediately stepped in to comfort him. And the man looked at me like he understood why I said it, but also the damage it caused. And I just stepped back, realizing I was being emotionally assigned to something I never accepted and then being blamed for the emotional consequences of refusing it. And then my phone buzzed again, and I already didn't want to look, but I did. And it was another message, this time longer, saying you were never the first person she used to explain things away. Ask about the last neighbor. And when I read it out loud, both Kayla and the man went quiet in a different way, like that wasn't new information to them. And I looked at her and said, who else did you do this with? And she didn't answer immediately. And in that pause, I realized this wasn't just about me at all. It was a pattern, a cycle of people being placed into roles to simplify a life. That was actually complicated. And right as she finally opened her mouth to respond, there was another knock, this time directly on my door again. Slower, deliberate, and when I opened it, I saw someone I hadn't seen before, but who looked like they had already been part of this conversation, long before I arrived. And they just said, so you're the new one. And I stood there realizing whatever explanation was coming next wasn't going to clear anything up, it was going to show me just how many people I had been unknowingly added into. And when that person said, so you're the new one, it hit me in this weird way because it confirmed I wasn't even the center of this situation. I was just the latest name dropped into something that had been going on long before. I got there, and I just stood in the doorway staring at him while everyone behind me in the apartment went quiet again, like they were waiting to see how I reacted. And I asked him straight up who he was and why he was talking like that. And he just nodded toward Kayla and said, I've seen how this goes. And that's when I felt this shift because Kayla didn't argue, didn't deny it. She just looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, like she already knew exactly what he meant. And the man from earlier stepped forward asking if he knew her, and the guy shrugged like it was obvious and said something like he had lived in the building before me, that he had also been in a similar position, where people started assuming things about his involvement with Mason. And I just felt my stomach drop because that meant I wasn't isolated in this. I was part of a pattern. And I turned to Kayla asking, how many people has this happened with? And she immediately said, that's not fair. But she didn't actually deny it. And the older woman from earlier, who had somehow stayed in the background of all this, stepped forward again and said quietly that situations like this often create informal role assignment. When communication breaks down, and I interrupted her saying, stop turning this into some system explanation, I'm asking a simple question. How many people have been told there's something they're not? And nobody answered right away. And that silence was louder than anything else. And the guy who just arrived finally said he wasn't here to accuse anyone, just to clarify that when he lived there, he had also been referred to as helping regularly with Mason despite never agreeing to anything like that. And I just looked at Kayla because now it wasn't just theory. It was confirmed repetition. And she finally said, it wasn't supposed to become a label. And I cut her off saying, but it did. And Mason from the couch quietly asked, what's a label? And that question just made everything worse because it reminded everyone that none of this was supposed to be affecting him at all. And I tried to explain gently that it means people call things what they think they are instead of what they actually are. And he just nodded slowly, like he didn't fully understand, but felt the seriousness anyway. And the man who showed up earlier suddenly said, this is why it needs to be corrected officially. And Kayla immediately shook her head saying she didn't want things to become formal or messy. And I laughed because at that point everything was already messy beyond repair. And I said, you don't get to avoid formal consequences after creating informal consequences for everyone else. And she looked like she wanted to argue but didn't have the words anymore. And the older woman said something about needing to document accurate roles going forward, and I immediately said, I don't want to be documented as anything. I want my name out of all of this. And the new guy nodded like he understood that completely, saying that was exactly what happened to him too, that even after he left, people still referenced him as if he had been part of something he never agreed to. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about Kayla or Mason. It was about how easily people can be assigned identities, when no one bothers to draw clear lines early. And I just stood there feeling this mix of frustration and exhaustion because I didn't even recognize my own life in the way it was being described by everyone else. And then my phone buzzed again, and I already didn't want to look, but I did anyway. And it was another message, this time just one sentence. She never told you why the last person stopped showing up. And when I read it out loud, Kayla immediately went still, like the room temperature dropped. And the man asked, what does that mean? And she said nothing. And that silence again told me more than any explanation could. And I turned to her and said, who was here before me? And she finally looked at me properly for the first time in a while and said, someone who tried to set boundaries too. And that was the first honest thing she'd said in a while. And I just exhaled because now it wasn't just confusion or misunderstanding or neighborhood rumor. It was starting to look like a repeating cycle that I had walked into without knowing it. And right as I processed that, there was another knock at the door downstairs again. And this time nobody moved immediately, because we all understood that every knock wasn't just a person anymore. It was another piece of the same story I hadn't been told I was part of. And I looked at Kayla and said quietly, this has to stop somewhere. And she didn't disagree this time, but she also didn't know how to stop it. And that's when I realized the worst part wasn't the rumors or the confusion or even the pressure. It was that nobody in this room actually agreed on where the truth started. And when that last knock echoed through the building again, nobody moved right away because it felt like we were all starting to understand the pattern. Every knock meant another layer of the same story getting pulled in. And I remember just standing there in the doorway with everyone behind me, frozen in different levels of guilt, confusion, or exhaustion. And then I finally went downstairs again because I needed to see what was actually coming this time instead of hearing it filtered through everyone else. And when I opened the building door, there wasn't just one person anymore. There were two, and one of them was holding a phone out like they had been recording or documenting something. And the other one looked like they had been here before too. Like this was becoming a repeat visit for multiple people. And the one with the phone immediately said my name again. Like it was already established who I was in their version of the situation. And I just stopped them and said, before you say anything, I need to understand why everyone keeps treating me like I'm part of this. And the guy looked at me like I was asking the wrong question and said something. Like, because your name has been used in multiple contexts involving caregiving for Mason. And I immediately shook my head saying, no, stop, that's not involvement. That's someone talking about me. And the second person finally stepped in and said they had been contacted after patterns of confusion were reported by multiple residents. And I said, confusion about what? And they hesitated before saying, who is responsible for Mason's day-to-day stability? And I literally laughed out loud. Because I said, that's not even a question I was ever asked directly. And that's when they both looked at each other like that was the problem. Like nothing had been direct. And I just felt this wave of frustration because I was realizing I wasn't even being judged for actions I took. I was being judged for conversations I never had. And then I asked them straight up who first said my name in connection with responsibility. And they said it came up through community discussion. And I cut them off saying, that's not an answer. And the phone holding guy finally admitted that Kayla had been the consistent source of information about my presence being regular and supportive, not as a formal claim but as repeated explanation in casual contexts. And I just stood there thinking how something casual gets repeated until it becomes something I'm suddenly accountable for. And I went back upstairs immediately because I couldn't handle hearing it secondhand anymore. And when I walked in the apartment, everyone looked at me like they already knew what was said. And I just turned to Kayla and said, you have to stop telling people I'm involved with your child. And she immediately said, I didn't say it like that. And I snapped back, it doesn't matter how you said it, it's how it's being used. And the man from earlier stepped in saying, this is exactly what miscommunication looks like when it doesn't get corrected. Early, and I turned to him saying, I wasn't part of any communication at all. And Mason was sitting there watching all of it quietly again like he was trying to understand why adults kept arguing about him like he wasn't in the room. And he finally said, am I in trouble? And that question just hit differently because it showed he thought this was something he caused. And I immediately said, no, you're not in trouble. And Kayla went to him to calm him down. But the tension didn't go away, it just shifted. And then the older woman said something about how records needed to be corrected to prevent further misinterpretation. And I said, I don't care about records. I care about not being assigned roles I never accepted. And Kayla finally looked directly at me and said, I didn't think it would become this serious. And I said, that's the problem. You never thought about how it would affect me at all. And that made her go quiet. And the man looked frustrated now too, saying, none of this should have involved him in the first place. And then my phone buzzed again and I didn't even want to look, but I did. And it said, ask her what she told Mason about you before he started calling you that. And I just stood there because that was the first time it shifted from adults misunderstanding me to a child, being given a version of reality that included me. And I turned slowly to Kayla and said, what did you tell him about me? And she immediately said, nothing wrong. But her voice was different now, less confident. And I said, that's not an answer. And the room went quiet again. And Mason quietly asked from the couch, did I say something wrong? And I just looked at him and said, no, you didn't do anything wrong. But inside I realized the damage wasn't about blame anymore. It was about how long a story had been left, uncorrected until everyone started believing different versions of it. And Kayla finally admitted softly that she didn't always correct him. when he made assumptions because it felt easier in the moment. And I just exhaled because that was the repeating theme again, easier in the moment, harder for everyone later. And I said, "You can't build stability on silence and assumptions." And she didn't respond. And that's when another knock came again. But this time nobody even moved immediately because it didn't feel like a new interruption anymore. It felt like continuation, like the next step of something already in motion. And I stood there realizing I had walked into a situation where nobody agreed on the truth. Nobody agreed on the roles, and nobody agreed on where the story actually began. And that was when I finally understood the worst part of all, of it wasn't being misunderstood, it was that everyone was confidently acting like they understood, something that kept changing depending on who was talking. And when that next knock came, I didn't even move right away because it honestly felt like reacting wouldn't change anything anymore. Like the building itself had become part of the conversation, and I just stood there for a second listening to the silence inside the apartment behind me where nobody was speaking either. And then I finally opened the door, and there was no dramatic new person this time, just one of the older neighbors from the building hallway. Someone I had seen before but never talked to. And she looked uncomfortable, like she didn't even want to be there. And she said my name softly, like she was trying to be careful with it. And then she said she just wanted to clear something up, because apparently people had been talking again. And I immediately asked, talking about what exactly? She hesitated before saying, there had been confusion for a while about who was helping out with Mason. And I stopped her right there and said, no. Stop using that word, I don't help out. I don't have a role, I live next door. And she nodded like she understood, but then added that from the outside. It didn't always look like that because of how often I was seen around Kayla's unit. And I just shook my head because that's when it hit me again. How perception was being treated like evidence. And I told her, being seen near, someone doesn't make you responsible for their life. And she actually agreed, but said that wasn't how it had been interpreted over time. And that phrase, over time, just made me feel tired. Because it meant this wasn't a single misunderstanding. It was a buildup. And I went back upstairs again because I couldn't keep doing this conversation in pieces. And when I walked in, Kayla already looked like she knew more people had been talking. And I said straight up, your neighbors are still talking about me like I'm involved with your kid. And she said, I can't control what people assume. And I said, but you can control what you tell them. And that's when she went quiet again. And the man finally stepped in saying, this is exactly why boundaries need to be explicit from the beginning. And I snapped back, I never agreed to be part of any boundary conversation in the first place. And Mason, who had been listening quietly again, suddenly asked, why does everyone keep saying I have two dads? And that question just froze everything because it exposed how many different versions of reality he had been hearing without anyone realizing how it was landing on him. And I immediately said, you don't have two dads, trying to keep it simple for him. And he nodded slowly but looked confused. And Kayla tried to comfort him, but she looked overwhelmed now too. And the older woman said something about needing clarity for the child's environment moving forward. And I just shook my head saying, you keep talking like this is a system issue. But I'm a person who never agreed to be part of any system. And then I turned to Kayla and said, you have to tell me exactly what you told people. Not versions, not summaries. Exactly what words you used. And she finally admitted that when explaining things in passing, she used phrases like, he's around a lot, he helps, and he's been really consistent, because it avoided explaining the messy parts of her situation. And I just stood there because I realized those words weren't lies in her mind, but they became something else entirely once repeated by everyone else. And the man said, you see how that becomes something bigger than intent. And she nodded slowly like she finally understood the scale of it. But it didn't undo anything. And my phone buzzed again and I almost didn't check it, but I did. And this time it was just a single line saying, ask her about the first time. She let someone call you his dad. And I looked up immediately and said, when did this start? And Kayla hesitated for a long time before saying it. It was months ago, when someone at the building casually referred to me that way, and she didn't correct it because it felt awkward in the moment. And I just laughed because that was the origin of everything, one uncorrected moment that turned into repetition. And I said, so this all started because it was awkward to say no. And she didn't answer. And that silence told me everything. And then another knock came again, slower this time. But nobody even reacted immediately because it didn't feel like an interruption anymore. It felt like the next chapter arriving whether we were ready or not. And I stood there realizing I had spent the entire night trying to pull myself out of a story that other people had already been repeating long before. I knew I was in it. And the worst part wasn't that I was misunderstood, it was that by the time I found out, everyone already believed they understood it better than I did. And when that next knock came, I didn't even react right away. Because at that point, it felt like the building was just part of the conversation now. Like every door, every hallway. Every person had already decided I was in the middle of something whether I agreed or not. And I just stood there for a second listening to everyone breathing. Behind me in the apartment. Kayla quiet, the man tense. Mason still confused on the couch. And then I finally opened the door again expecting another neighbor. Another explanation. Another piece of this mess. But this time it was different because it was someone I actually recognized from earlier. Paperwork conversations downstairs. And he didn't waste time. He just said my name and said, we need to stop this from spreading further. And I immediately said, I agree. So start by telling people I'm not involved in anything. And he nodded like that was reasonable, but then said that once a narrative has already circulated informally, it doesn't disappear instantly. It has to be corrected through consistent clarification. And I just laughed because I said, you're talking about me like I'm a rumor instead of a person. And he actually paused at that like he hadn't considered how it sounded. And then behind me I heard footsteps because Kayla had followed me to the doorway. And she said, this is getting out of control. And I turned to her and said, no, this got out of control the moment you let people define me without correcting them. And that made her go quiet again. And the man from earlier stepped closer saying, we need to separate emotional frustration from factual correction. And I snapped back, there are no facts being corrected. There are just people deciding what I am based on convenience. And that's when the guy from downstairs finally admitted something worse. That in multiple informal conversations, my presence had been described as consistent support for Mason's household environment. And I just shook my head because that phrase sounded harmless. but meant something completely different when repeated enough times. And I said, "That's not support. That's just me existing in proximity." And he nodded but didn't disagree. And Mason suddenly came to the doorway behind us and asked, "Why does everyone keep saying my family is confusing?" And I turned around immediately because I didn't want him absorbing any of this incorrectly. And I said, "Your family isn't confusing. Adults are just bad at explaining things." And Kayla looked like she wanted to help but didn't know how anymore. And the man asked again what needed to happen to correct it. And I said the only thing that needed to happen was for everyone to stop referencing me at all in relation to Mason, because I never agreed to it in the first place. And there was a pause where nobody argued. Nobody defended it, nobody justified it. And for the first time, it felt like everyone was realizing how much of this had been built without my consent at all. And then Kayla finally said quietly, "I didn't think it would affect you like this." And I just looked at her and said, "You didn't think about me at all. You thought about convenience." And that hit harder because she didn't deny it. And the man exhaled like he was finally seeing the full scope of it too, saying, "This needs to be officially clarified at every level then." And I said, "I don't care about levels, I care about it stopping." And Mason stood there again asking softly, "Are you going to stay?" And that question just hit differently, because it wasn't about roles or labels or any of that anymore. It was just a kid trying to understand if people were going to keep leaving his life in confusing ways. And I looked at him and said, "I'm not your dad, but I'm not trying to hurt you either." And he nodded slowly like he didn't fully understand, but accepted it. And Kayla stepped in and held him closer. And for a second it felt like things might finally settle, like the tension might actually drop, until my phone buzzed again. And this time I already knew I shouldn't look, but I did anyway. And it said, "You still haven't asked her why she chose you specifically." And when I read it out loud, the entire room went quiet again in a different way, because that wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. That was about intent. And I turned slowly to Kayla and said, "Why me?" And she didn't answer immediately. And in that pause, everything changed again, because it stopped being about rumors or assumptions or community, perception, and became about choice. And she finally said softly, "Because you were the only one who didn't immediately walk away." And that answer just sat there in the air like it meant something bigger than she was willing to explain. And I just stared at her because that was the first time it felt like there was a reason behind all of it that I hadn't heard yet. And behind me the man said, "That's not a reason to assign someone a role in a child's life." And she nodded but still didn't fully explain. And I could feel something bigger underneath everything she was saying. Like there was still a missing piece none of us had touched yet. And then another knock came. But this time nobody moved at all because it didn't feel like the outside interrupting anymore. It felt like the final part of the story arriving whether we were ready or not. And when that final knock came, nobody moved at first, not even me, because it didn't feel like another interruption anymore. It felt like the end of pretending. We were going to slowly piece this together in a normal way. And I remember just standing there staring at the door like I already knew whoever was on the other side wasn't going to make anything simpler. And then I opened it, and this time it wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't paperwork people. It wasn't someone checking in. It was a younger guy holding a small stack of printed messages and screenshots, like he had been collecting something. And he looked directly at me and said, "You're the one they've been talking about." And I immediately said, "I'm the one everyone keeps talking around, not about." And he actually nodded like that was exactly what he meant. And then he said something that made my stomach drop, because he said he had seen the way my name had been repeated across different conversations in the building group, chats and casual discussions, and that it had slowly turned into a fixed idea of me being involved in Mason's life. And I just shook my head saying, "That's not real involvement, that's repetition." And he held up the papers and said, "That's how it becomes real to people." And I hated that he was kind of right in the worst way. And behind me I could hear Kayla stepping closer again, and the man from earlier asking what was on the papers. And the guy finally said, they were screenshots of messages where my name had been referenced indirectly over time as the consistent presence, the helper, the one next door who's always there. And I felt my chest tighten because it was the exact pattern again. Harmless phrases becoming something else when repeated. And I turned to Kayla and said, "You need to understand, this is what you created." And she immediately said, "I didn't create anything." But her voice wasn't as confident anymore. And I said, "You didn't correct it. That's the same thing in practice." And she went quiet. And Mason from the couch asked again softly, "Why are people showing papers about us?" And I looked at him and said, "They're trying to fix confusion that shouldn't have started." And he nodded, but looked even more unsure now. And the man stepped in saying, "We need to end all informal references immediately. No more assumptions, no more casual explanations." And the guy with the papers agreed, but added that even if it stops now, it already spread through enough people that it won't just disappear overnight. And that's when I finally felt it fully. That I wasn't dealing with a single misunderstanding anymore. I was dealing with something that had already taken shape in other people's minds and was now just reacting to reality being corrected late. And I said, "So what now? I just live with a label I never agreed to until it fades." And nobody had a clean answer for that. And Kayla finally said quietly, "I didn't think it would get this far." And I said, "That's the only thing you keep saying." And she looked like she wanted to argue, but didn't. And then the guy with the papers said something that made everything feel even heavier. That sometimes in small communities, once a role gets assigned socially, it takes active correction from multiple people to undo it. And I just laughed because I said, "So I need a team to undo something I never started." And the man nodded like that was exactly the problem. And Mason suddenly stood up again and said, "Can someone just tell me what's true?" And that question just froze everything, because it exposed the real issue underneath all of this. Nobody had been prioritizing clarity for him at all. And I looked at Kayla and said, "You should have done that from the beginning." And she finally nodded slowly like she knew that too. And for the first time, the room wasn't arguing. It was just quiet in this heavy way, where everyone understood there wasn't a simple fix. And then my phone buzzed again one last time. And I almost didn't check it because it felt pointless now. But I did. And it said, "The reason she chose you isn't what you think. And you're still missing the first decision she made before any of this started." And I looked up at Kayla and said, "What decision?" And she didn't answer immediately. Just stared at the floor like she had been holding that part back the entire time. And that's when I realized whatever explanation was coming next wasn't about clearing my name anymore. It was about revealing why I was placed into this story at all in the first place. I thought that was the end of it once I moved out. Like I could just leave and everything would reset back to normal, but that wasn't how it went at all, because a few days later I got a message from someone I didn't even recognize, and it just said, "You don't actually think you were random in this, right?" And I remember just staring at it because it felt like even after everything got corrected, people were still arguing about what I was supposed to mean in their version of the story, and I blocked it. But it kept messing with me because it proved something worse than the misunderstanding itself, which is that people don't let go of the version of you that fits their narrative easily. And what really got me was later hearing from someone who still lived there that some people were saying, I overreacted by leaving, like I was the problem for refusing to stay in a situation I never agreed to in the first place. And apparently there were even people saying I should have stepped up for the kid anyway because he got attached, like that somehow overrides basic reality. And that part honestly made me mad all over again, because it flipped everything backwards, like I owed something just because I was nearby long enough to get labeled. But the worst part was realizing how split people were about it. Some were like, he was right, they shouldn't have assumed that. And others were like, he still abandoned the situation, even though there was never a situation I signed up for to begin with. And it turned into this whole argument where my actual consent didn't even seem to matter in people's opinions, only how they felt about what I should have done. And the final thing I found out was that even after everything got corrected, some people still referred to me in conversations like I was involved, just in a quieter way, like the correction didn't erase the first impression. It just made people whisper it instead of say it out loud. That's when I realized the real issue wasn't Kayla, or the neighbors, or even the kid misunderstanding things. It was how fast people decide a version of you, and how hard it is to ever fully undo it, even when it's wrong. And I still don't know what annoys me more, that it happened in the first place, or that even after everything, people still argue about whether I was wrong for not living inside someone else's assumption. Because if you were in my situation, would you stay and accept a role you never agreed to just to keep everyone else comfortable? Or walk away and become the bad guy in everyone else's version of your story?